just assume this is some sort of adversarial or foreign technology.
Most of the more than 120 incidents over the past 2 decades are not from the U.S. military or other advanced U.S. government technology.
It was a surprise, actually. I drifted into this field of inquiry, namely an alternative view of history, by accident. Way back in the 1980s, I used to be the East Africa correspondent for The Economist. I was a journalist, and I was based in Nairobi, in Kenya, and I traveled widely in the region. And one of the countries on my beat was Ethiopia. And in Ethiopia, I came across a puzzle. It turns out that Ethiopia claims to possess the lost Ark of the Covenant, as in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Sounds like a very fanciful claim, but then I found myself on one of my trips in the city of Aksum, outside a barred enclosure surrounding a small chapel, and spoke through a translator to the monk who is responsible for that chapel. And he said, yes, we have the Ark of the Covenant in here with the tablets of stone inside it. I thought it was just a great story. I thought there's a really interesting story to tell here, and I started slowly to look into it. And what I discovered was that actually this claim to possess the Ark of the Covenant is fundamental to Ethiopian Christianity. And that in itself is odd, because the Ark is a pre-Christian relic. Indeed, every church in Ethiopia, there's more than 20,000 of them. Every one of them has a replica of the Ark of the Covenant or of the tablets of stone in its Holy of Holies. And if those replicas are removed, the church ceases to be a church. So clearly this was a rather strong tradition, not a marginal tradition. I started talking to academics about it, many of whom had never been to Ethiopia and done any boots on the ground work there, but they universally dismissed it as a fantasy of the Ethiopian royal family. There is a story told in Ethiopia as to how the Ark of the Covenant got there. And the story briefly is that the Queen of Sheba was an Ethiopian queen. She made her famous visit to Jerusalem, had a sexual encounter with King Solomon, became pregnant, and returned to Ethiopia to give birth to their son, whose name was Menelik, which means the son of the wise man. As a young man in his 20s, this Menelik, we are told in the Kebre Nagast, that's the Ethiopian source, the Glory of Kings, went back to Jerusalem, was recognized by his father, spent a year at the court, and then effectively stole the Ark of the Covenant and carried it off to Ethiopia. This is the basic story as told in Ethiopia. As a story in itself, it could not be stood up. The dates are all wrong. We know that the Ark of the Covenant was in the Temple of Solomon, the first temple in Jerusalem, at least until the 600s before Christ. And this is long after the time of Solomon. But then I began to find interesting connections and mysteries. It turned out that an apostate king, a pagan king, had sat on the throne of Israel in the 600s before Christ and had installed a pagan idol in the Holy of Holies. And many Judaic scholars told me that it was inconceivable that those who were loyal to the traditional religion would have allowed the Ark of the Covenant to remain in the temple. It would have been taken out during the reign of this monarch, whose name was Manasseh, and taken to some place of safekeeping. Then, lo and behold, I discovered that exactly at that time, during the reign of Manasseh, a Jewish temple was built in Egypt on the island of Elephantine, near the modern city of Aswan. And this temple is not just some sort of fantasy. It's an archaeological site, which was in the 1980s and 1990s being excavated by the German Archaeological Institute. There's no doubt whatsoever about its existence. The mystery is why it was ever built there in the first place. But it made sense if it was built as a place of refuge for the Ark of the Covenant. Again, to cut a long story short, this is fact, not speculation, that Jewish population on the island of Elephantine remained in place for another 200 years until the 400s before Christ, at which point there was a conflict with the Egyptians and they were driven out. And it's thought this was because they were sacrificing rams, and the deity of the island of Elephantine is Khnum, a ram-headed deity. No evidence that they were massacred, they were just driven out. No evidence that they went north through a hostile Egypt. A lot to suggest that they went south following the Nile River system. The Blue Nile ends up in Ethiopia. It ends up in its sources in Lake Tana in Ethiopia. And that is the heartland of people who are known as the Falashas. They call themselves the Beta Israel. These are Ethiopia's indigenous Jews. And they practice an Old Testament form of Judaism. They don't have rabbis, they do have priests, they don't recognize the Talmud, they do have the Torah, as though they were frozen in time from the Old Testament period. And they had their own story about how they had brought the ark from Elephantine to Ethiopia in this time of turmoil, and suddenly all the pieces fitted together. It made a very strong, in my opinion, circumstantial case. And I was just astonished by the derisory manner in which academics just completely dismissed this without actually doing any legwork or really considering the story closely. In other words, the Ethiopian claim to possess the Ark of the Covenant may be based on fact, not the fact in their national epic, but a solidly researched series of historical clues. That was the time when I began to realize that we can't take everything academics say at face value, that they have a vision of the past, they have an idea of the past, and all too often their work is to make facts fit into that pre-existing vision, even if it involves distorting and bending and twisting and actually ripping up those facts. And I carried that skepticism of academia into my later work. The book that I wrote about Ethiopia's claim to possess the Ark of the Covenant is called The Sign and the Seal, A Quest for the Lost Ark of the Covenant. It was published in 1992. But I followed that up in 1995, with what is probably my best known book, which is Fingerprints of the Gods, which is a quest for a lost civilization. What I carried with me was my skepticism of academia. During the research for The Sign and the Seal, I had to go to Egypt for the first time, and I found myself in front of the Great Pyramid, this 6 million ton wonder with a 13-acre footprint, 481 feet high, just a perfect monument. And academics are telling me it's built as the tomb for a specific pharaoh in the 4th dynasty. And I thought, hang on, this is just them again, sticking us with their preconceived notions and not really examining their evidence. There's no evidence that the Great Pyramid was ever intended as a tomb. Its purpose is much more complicated, much more mysterious than that.
Well said. And as a matter of fact, we are still discovering things with regards to the pyramids of Giza that 50, 100 years ago or any time in the past, it contradicts to what they used to know. And still, it's something of serious mystery. And I don't know what it's going to take to actually figure out the mysteries, unless somehow we're able to decipher. I don't know, is there any missing hieroglyphics or anything in the past or anything in the pyramid that would give credence to who built them? Because to say that all those blocks and tons were carried by slave labor and stacked in such a...
Well, that's obviously rubbish. I've had the privilege to climb the Great Pyramid 5 times, and this is a work of skilled artisans. This is not the work of begrudging slave labor. This is the work of people who were masters of their craft in every possible way. Everything about that monument is perfection. And while we may not find texts which tell us about it, it is in itself a form of document or a form of text. The fact that it encodes the dimensions of the Earth on a scale of 1 to 43,200. Measure the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid, multiply by 43,200, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. Measure the original height of the Great Pyramid, multiply by 43,200, you get the polar radius. of the Earth. Actually, academics know this, but they, of course, believe it's a coincidence. I can't think of anything less coincidental, since the scale used is a scale defined by a key motion of the Earth itself, and that is the precession of the Earth's axis, which unfolds at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. 43,200 is a multiple of 72. So right there in its architecture, in its design principles, the Great Pyramid is telling us that it was built by people who knew that the Earth is a planet, who knew the dimensions of the Earth, and who understood the key motions of the Earth. And that is way beyond anything that is supposed to have been available in Egypt in the 4th dynasty. Let me be clear, however, I do not seek to divorce the Great Pyramid from the ancient Egyptians. The Great Pyramid, in my view, is a multi-dimensional project. I think that certain parts of it are deeply prehistoric, notably the subterranean chamber, which is cut down through solid rock 100 feet beneath the base of the pyramid. I would trace that back, that very ancient sacred shrine, in the original primeval mound, because the Great Pyramid is built around a natural hill about 30 feet high. I think that was a sacred site going back more than 12,000 years ago. But I do believe that the pyramids were built by the ancient Egyptians with the skills and the abilities that they have, but drawing upon very ancient knowledge handed down to them from prehistoric antiquity. So I want to be absolutely clear about that. I am not one of those who are saying that the Great Pyramid or the other pyramids were built 12,000 years ago. There is a deep connection between the site of Giza and the period of around 12,500 years ago, a very strong connection. But that's a connection that unfolded over a long period of time. That was looked back upon by the ancient Egyptians as what they called Zep Tepi, the first time. It was a time of enormous importance to them, and they constructed these monuments as a shrine and as a memorial to that period. But I'm very clear in my own mind that the ancient Egyptians were involved in the largest part of the construction of the Great Pyramid.
Now, it's clear to me, and I want to say most, if not all of the academics, that we have some lost knowledge. Now, the degree of what's lost varies depending on who you speak to. Now, if I went to, Stanford and spoke to the archaeology department ahead, I'm going to hear that the Giza pyramids were built 2500 BC.
Mm-hmm.
But
and what you would be hearing would largely be correct.
Okay, so with regards to ages, what ages that are in history books or in archaeology books of other structures, such as the Pyramid of Giza, Göbekli Tepe, which is fairly new discovery, which ones do they say a certain year that they estimated to be built, but are actually wrong?
Well, Göbekli Tepe's construction date is really solidly established because, fortunately, the makers of Göbekli Tepe turned it into a time capsule. It was created around 12,000 years ago, a little bit less than 12,000 years ago, let's say 11,600 years ago. And that site then ran for about 1,000 years, and then its builders completely buried it beneath what looked like and was taken for thousands of years to be a natural hill. Göbekli Tepe actually means the pot-bellied hill in the Turkish language, but that wasn't a natural hill. It was an entirely man-made hill. The entire site was covered up, decommissioned, and passed forward to the future as a time capsule. I'm very satisfied with the dating of Göbekli Tepe at around 11,600 years ago. I see no reason to dispute it or to consider it older. That's a very interesting date. That date, 11,600 years ago, marks the end of a geological epoch called the Younger Dryas, which began 12,800 years ago. So you have 1,200 years from roughly 12,800 years ago to 11,600 years ago of absolutely cataclysmic turmoil on this planet. And there is a growing body of evidence supported by more than 60 leading scientists in the earth science and geophysics fields that what happened was that a very large comet entered the inner solar system, probably as much as 20 or 30,000 years ago, on an Earth-crossing orbit. However, the comet did not initially impact the Earth. What almost all comets do, is it began to fragment into multiple fragments until those fragments produced a debris stream that was 30 million kilometers wide. with little filaments of debris within it, some of them containing very large bits of the comet, some of them containing much smaller bits of the comet. And the evidence is that in that period between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, the Earth's orbit intersected several of these filaments, and there were repeated bombardments of the Earth by fragments of this former giant comet. And when I say giant comet, I mean an object that would originally have been about 100 kilometers in diameter, but which broke up into multiple fragments. Everybody knows comets do this. We all remember Shoemaker-Levy 9 hitting Jupiter in 1994. The tremendous damage that it did to the surface of Jupiter, and the fact that Shoemaker-Levy 9 broke up into 21 fragments before it bombarded that planet. So something similar happened to the Earth. There were a series of impacts in that period that is called the Younger Dryas. There was huge climate change. There were massive sea level rises. This is the time of the extinction of the megafauna, the saber-toothed tigers, the woolly rhinos, the mammoths, the mastodons. They all went down during the Younger Dryas. And I would suggest that we lost track of a much more advanced than is normally given credit for, a much more advanced human civilization at that time. Yes, there were hunter-gatherers in the world at that time. I would say the majority of the world's population were hunter-gatherers, but there were also much more advanced peoples who we would recognize as a true civilization today. I'm not saying they were flying to the moon or building trains, but I am saying that they had an advanced knowledge of the cosmos, very sophisticated information, and they were capable of creating enormous projects. And Göbekli Tepe, which I've had the privilege to visit many times, is a truly astounding and incredibly ambitious piece of megalithic architecture on an absolutely enormous scale. What it ties into with at Giza is the Great Sphinx. I've said that I believe the pyramids were at least completed and substantially built by the ancient Egyptians themselves on the basis of a legacy of knowledge from the deep past. But the Great Sphinx comes from that time that the ancient Egyptians called Zeb Tepe the first time. The Great Sphinx is a work that was created during the Younger Dryas between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, exactly like Göbekli Tepe.
With regards to lost knowledge, one great thing that me and you and several other people that have paid attention with regards to the placement of the pyramids, they align to our solar system, to planets, right? And wouldn't that be
No, not to my knowledge. I've never come across that notion that they align to any particular planets. What the three great pyramids of Giza do is they represent on the ground the three stars of the belt of the constellation of Orion. And here's a curiosity. Because of this phenomenon that I mentioned, the wobble on the axis of the Earth that's called precession, because the Earth is the viewing platform from which we observe the stars, the positions and rising times of the stars in the sky over periods of thousands of years change very, very, very gradually. And one of the mysteries of Giza is that the patterning as above, so below of Orion's belt on the ground in the form of the three great pyramids is as those stars looked 12,500 years ago, approximately. However, there are narrow shafts cut through the body of the Great Pyramid, which point to four stars, two in the southern sky, two in the northern sky, and they lock into those stars in the epoch of 2,500 BC, 4,500 years ago. So there's a very complete time scan there, which is what the pyramid is saying to us is, we remember the date that you call 12,500 years ago, but we also remember the date that you call 4,500 years ago. They're an interdimensional project connecting those two dates, in my opinion. This is just my view. I'm not claiming this is fact, but it's based on 30 years of work in this field. And by the way, we must pay credit to Robert Bauval with his 1994 book, The Orion Mystery. Robert put on the map the Orion correlation, the very powerful evidence that the three great pyramids are modeled on the three stars of the belt of Orion. Okay, well, fortunately, we have a very reliable reporter to give us this information, and the name of that reporter is Plato, the Greek philosopher Plato. The earliest surviving report of the lost civilization of Atlantis comes in Plato's Timaeus and Critias dialogues. And there Plato very helpfully provides us with an exact date for the destruction of Atlantis. He refers to a visit made to Egypt by the Greek lawmaker Solon, and we know that visit took place, and we know when it took place. It took place around 600 BC in our calendar. And what Plato tells us is that Atlantis was swallowed up by the sea and destroyed 9,000 years before the time of Solon. So that is a date coming from a very reputable source. He's telling us that Atlantis was submerged 9,600 BC or 11,600 years ago. 11,600 years ago, give or take 20 years. And that date, 11,600 years ago, is the exact date that we find Göbekli Tepe being constructed, I would suggest, by the survivors of a lost civilization. Yes, I do. Twice. At the beginning of the Younger Dryas, very puzzlingly, because the Younger Dryas, what you need to understand about the Younger Dryas is that for 2,000 years before it, the world had been gradually and politely warming up. This was the Ice Age. North America and Northern Europe were covered in ice sheets miles deep, enormous quantities of ice. And as a result, all that water locked up in ice on the ice caps, sea level was much lower than it is today. Indeed, at the peak of the Ice Age, about 21,000 years ago, sea level was 400 feet lower than it is today. And that 400-foot rise in sea level occurred in a series of episodes following that. But the interesting thing is that the Younger Dryas, which sets in 12,800 years ago, follows a period of warming, but it's an instant deep freeze. The world suddenly gets incredibly cold again. But puzzlingly, there is a huge release of meltwater into the world ocean at that time, and sea levels rise significantly. This is not something that you would expect in a period when the world has gone cold. You would expect the ice to stay ice and not turn into water. But the argument of what turned it into water is very simple. Comet impacts, fragments of this giant comet impacted the North American ice cap. Tremendous amount of heat and shock were released, and this caused a huge flow of meltwater into the world ocean. Then the world stabilizes again, very cold period for the next 1,200 years, and then suddenly, massively it warms up, and the last of the ice caps 11,600 years ago collapse into the world ocean, and that's what geologists call meltwater pulse 1b. It's a huge rise in sea level. If we were to face such a rise in sea level in the range of 40 or 50 feet today, it would wipe out our civilization completely, because so much of our civilization is based around coastlines. That happened with meltwater pulse 1b around 11,600 years ago, and the evidence that suggests what happened is that there was a further bombardment of cometary fragments. But this time, instead of hitting an ice cap, they hit an ocean. They hit the ocean, send up a huge cloud of water vapor into the upper atmosphere, creating a greenhouse effect that causes the last meltdown of the ice sheets. It's a theory. It's supported, as I say, by more than 60 major scientists. They call themselves the Comet Research Group. Their material is online and has been published again and again in the most reputable scientific journals, including Nature and Scientific Reports and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and so on. They certainly have opponents. There are people who don't think that a comet hit the Earth, but the evidence is mounting, continuously mounting, that this was indeed the case, and that this explains both the beginning and the end of the Younger Dryas and the huge sea level rises that took place then. I mean, it's clear now that anatomically modern humans are a hybrid species. We are a hybrid species, and we carry in our DNA the DNA of other ancestral species with whom we interbred to form ourselves. And those are primarily the Neanderthals, who go back 700,000 or 800,000 years into the past, and a more recently discovered species called the Denisovans. And the type site for the Denisovans is a cave in southern Siberia, which it's been my privilege to visit. It's the most extraordinary place. These were highly sophisticated creatures. They didn't look exactly like us. If we were to see them in the street today, we probably would blink, but they didn't look that different from us either. And genetically, they were close enough to interbreed with us. So populations today do still carry substantial quantities of Denisovan DNA. The most of it is actually found in Melanesia, in Papua New Guinea, and such places, even though the type site is in southern Siberia. They were a very widely distributed species. So also the Neanderthals were very widely distributed, and again have been hugely underestimated. We do them a disservice when we use Neanderthal as an insult. They were highly sophisticated creatures. They made beautiful art. They were just like us, just looked a little bit different, but not so different that we couldn't interbreed with them. And when I say we, who were we then? We were a species in the process of formation. We're the result of all these encounters with different hominids over long periods of time. Homo erectus goes back more than 1 million years. I think the species that you're referring to in the Philippines is, or in that area in general, it's actually on the island of Flores, is the so-called hobbits, Homo floresiensis, the little creatures, but again closely related to us. So the story of human ancestry is getting more and more complicated. We do have probably the earliest anatomically modern human skeletal remains so far found have come from Morocco, and they date back about 350,000 years. So what's happening is that the ancestry of the human species keeps getting pushed back. I don't mean to very primitive ancestors, I mean to rather sophisticated ancestors. And this, to me, is another reason to consider the possibility of a lost civilization, because, you know, if we accept the historians and the archaeologists at face value, the first civilizations aren't supposed to have emerged until 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, you know, with ancient Sumer in Mesopotamia. But it just doesn't make sense that we would have creatures with all the capacities that we have, indeed anatomically modern humans, living on the earth for 350,000 years. And they would wait until just 6,000 years ago to form a civilization. I'm convinced that there's something very, very major missing from the picture of our past. And that's really what I've devoted my work to for the last 30 years, is tracing down that possible lost civilization of prehistoric antiquity. Yeah, not only, and not even so much in Africa, but massively in Europe and in the Far East. There was a coexistence of anatomically modern humans and Neanderthals, and interbreeding, which is why quite a number of human populations today carry up to 4% of Neanderthal DNA. Interbreeding, and I suggest that our anatomically modern ancestors learned a lot from the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals were the masters of the Ice Age world, and our ancestors coming out of Africa, migrating into Europe, would have encountered the Neanderthals. We know they encountered them because we have their DNA, and would have learnt a huge range of skills from them. So rather than seeing the Neanderthals as primitive, stupid sort of ape men, we need to see them as rather beautiful, highly sophisticated creatures who really had mastered their environment and passed on their knowledge to us. Well, first of all, I need to declare an interest. I'm just not that interested in giants, personally. Okay. I'm just not that interested in giants unless they did interesting things. To me, a giant is just a very large piece of meat, unless it's actually doing something interesting. If it's doing something interesting, if the behavior indicates sophistication and advanced knowledge, then I'm interested, whether we're dealing with a midget or a giant. But giants in themselves don't massively interest me. You would be setting down in writing the oral traditions of your people that have existed for tens or hundreds of thousands of years before that. I'm actually not sure that writing is necessarily to be regarded as an advancement. It is a certain kind of advance, But in the process of writing things down, we stopped using our memories. I think if we go back into the ancestral past, you will find that human beings had much longer, much more detailed, much more intricate memories than we do today. We live in an instant culture. We set stuff down in writing and then we just forget about it. We can always go back and refer to the written document. But yes, to get to your point, I think that it would not be fiction. It would be what is regarded as the true history of the people. That has been passed down in oral tradition for millennia, and that is now being set down in writing. Well, I've noticed an evolution in the academic attitude to mythology over the last 30 years. When I started out researching in this field, which is well over 30 years ago, mythology was regarded as really unimportant as far as archaeology was concerned. It was considered to be the fantasies and fictions of our ancestors. But as time has gone by, that position has become harder and harder for academics to hold. And for example, it's quite widely accepted now that those worldwide accounts of the flood are memories of the events at the end of the Ice Age, when huge ice caps that covered Northern Europe and North America dissolved into the sea and raised sea level by a total of 400 feet. To put that into perspective, if you extend the continental shelves, if you lower sea level again by 400 feet, you're making available as much land as the whole of Europe and China added together. That's what was swallowed up in the sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. And how archaeologists can possibly claim that they've got a full picture of our past when they don't take account of that roughly 10 million square miles of land that was swallowed up by rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age. I just don't know how they can square that with their commitment to being rational. There is a thing called marine archaeology, but by and large, it's focused on shipwrecks from the historical period rather than looking for a lost civilization, because of course archaeologists don't believe there ever was a lost civilization. I spent 7 years of my research life scuba diving all around the world, and I can tell you that the continental shelves are full of man-made ruins that were covered by sea level rise at the end of the last ice age. Nevertheless, academics are beginning to recognize, for example, Aboriginal myths from Australia, speaking directly of sea level rise and in the right time frame to speak of the end of the ice age. So I think this is changing, and it's still somewhat disreputable, but it's beginning to be regarded as a reasonable line of inquiry to take mythology into account when you consider the antiquity of particular sites. Well, I think what's happened is that there is this now very widespread suspicion of so-called experts. We have been let down, lied to, misled by so-called experts for so long. Before the age of the internet, they could get away with it. But in the age of the internet, they can't get away with it anymore. And we see that everybody, almost everybody in a position of power and authority, whether they're an academic expert or whether they're a politician, fundamentally they just actually do tell a lot of lies. Or if they're not lies, they mislead themselves while they are misleading us. Archaeology is so certain and so adamant in its statements, and yet so many archaeological positions that were held as fact 50 or 100 years ago have been abandoned today. An example of that is the Clovis first dogma in North America, which was there was a Native American people who archaeologists call the Clovis people. That's because their artifacts were found near the town of Clovis, New Mexico. We don't know what they called themselves. And for 40 or 50 years, right through until the 1990s, even into the 2000s, it was held as an object of absolute fact by all American archaeologists and all archaeologists worldwide that these people, the so-called Clovis culture, were the first human beings ever to enter the Americas. And any archaeologist who dared to come up with an alternative theory or alternative evidence, for example, Jacques Cinq-Mars, who excavated Bluefish Caves in the Yukon and showed that humans had been there 25,000 years ago, which is 12,000 years before Clovis, those archaeologists were actually drummed out of the profession. They had their careers ruined. The research funding was withheld from them. They weren't able to continue with their work anymore. But it turned out they were right. And now we have evidence of humans in North America 30, 50,000 years ago. And the latest evidence puts humans in North America 130,000 years ago. And that's from a site near San Diego. It's called the Cerruti Mastodon site. And the evidence of a human presence there is compelling. And it dates back to 130,000 years ago. If you have humans in America, not 13,000 years ago, as Clovis first argued for so long, but 130,000 years ago, then the whole story changes. And this is beginning to be recognized. And with some embarrassment, archaeologists now admit, sorry guys, we got it wrong. Clovis weren't first after all. But make no apology to the careers ruined along the way and to the suppression of alternative information, which turned out to be true. Well, to them, it's perfectly obvious. Of course, they've been in the Americas for an enormously long period of time. Actually, the new evidence that's coming out traces the settlement of the Americas to South America first, and to North America second. And that seems counterintuitive, because the notion was that all of the inhabitants, the native inhabitants of the Americas, came from Siberia across the Bering Straits, which were above sea level during the Ice Age, which were a land bridge during the Ice Age. And it's thought that, everything's traced back to the old world, and then they crossed over the Bering land bridge into North America and then gradually made their way down to South America. Whereas in fact, some of the very oldest archaeological sites are being found in South America, not in North America. And this suggests that our ancestors entered the Americas by boat, not by land at all. And it opens up, again, a huge field for inquiry. Just as the submerged continental shelves are an area ripe for further research into rediscovering our lost past, so also places like the Amazon jungle are ripe for further research. The Amazon jungle has been substantially underserved by archaeology. It's a difficult place to work. We can't blame them. There is a little bit of archaeology being done, but the new work that's being done using LiDAR is detecting the traces of enormous cities in the Amazon going back tens of thousands of years, and suggests that the Amazon rainforest itself is a man-made jungle. That there are particular species of trees that yield foods that are useful to human beings that are hyperdominant in the Amazon. And this can only be the result of a deliberate policy going back millennia, deep into the last ice age. So the Amazon's a very promising area for finding more about our lost past. And although tragically parts of it are now being cleared to make way for commercial activities, what a stupid thing to do. Nevertheless, millions of square kilometers remain. Virgin jungle, unexplored, uninvestigated. I think a large part of the human story may be there. And jumping over to the other side of the world, I think the Sahara Desert is really interesting as well. It's totally uninhabitable today, but a green grassland filled with lakes and rivers during the Ice Age. We should be looking in precisely the places we're not looking now if we want to get to grips with our remote past. Interestingly, some of these rivers and lakes, prehistoric rivers and lakes of the Sahara that have been dry for thousands of years, show up on ancient maps, which again suggests to me that something much more sophisticated than hunter-gatherers existed in the world during the Ice Age. And again, I want to repeat, I'm not saying there was only an advanced civilization then. I'm saying that the world of the Ice Age, probably pretty much like the world today, is that there were hunter-gatherers, as we have hunter-gatherers living in the Amazon today, and as we have hunter-gatherers in the Namibian desert. But there was also a more advanced civilization, again, as we have today. And there probably were contacts and connections between the two. It's puzzling. He's like all human beings. He's complicated. He's not all bad or all good. There are things about Zahi I like and things about him that I don't. His role in setting back alternative inquiries into ancient Egypt has been most negative and unhelpful over the years, and I puzzle about. I wonder about that. Robert Boval and I, in our 1996 book, The Message of the Sphinx, looked into Zahi's background, and he did have a period when he was closely connected with the Edgar Cayce Foundation in America, which, of course, Edgar Cayce, the so-called sleeping prophet, argued that the Hall of Records of Atlantis would be found beneath the left forepaw of the Great Sphinx at a moment to be specified. And I sometimes wonder, just idle speculation, whether some of the resistance to alternative ideas about ancient Egypt has to do with somebody's timetable.